The library seemed to hold its breath. Inspector Graves, who had anticipated neither wit nor penetrating observation in equal measure, found himself momentarily adrift, as though someone had removed the floor from beneath his professional certainty. He recovered with the determination of a man clinging to bureaucratic protocol. "Quite," he said, in a tone that suggested he found nothing delicious about murder. The contradiction was noted immediately by the constable who first examined the body. "However, the family maintains," Whimsy interrupted gently, moving deeper into the library, precisely what one might expect them to maintain under circumstances of shock and inconvenience. "But before we concern ourselves with their collective protestations, I should like to examine the weapon more closely. Has it been handled since discovery?" "Photographed and dusted for fingerprints," Graves replied, "though the results proved inconclusive. Too many overlapping marks. The servants have all touched it at various points over the years, apparently. Mr. Ashford kept it in the desk drawer for protection," he claimed. Whimsy knelt beside the revolver without touching it, his eyes tracing its position with the intensity of a man reading theological doctrine. The carpet bore a faint depression where it had lain, undisturbed by the movements of constables and inspectors. He noted the angle of the weapon, the precise distance from the slumped hand, the particular way the morning light caught the barrel. "And the door?" he asked, without looking up. "Locked from the inside," Graves said. "The key was in the mechanism. Mr. Ashford came in here at approximately 8 o'clock after dinner. His nephew, Mr. Harold Ashford, heard the shot at 9. The door remained locked until the family, becoming concerned, forced entry at 9:30. Who forced entry? Mr. Harold Ashford, and the butler, Mr. Fitch. The housekeeper, Mrs. Crane, fetched the constabulary." Whimsy straightened, brushing an imaginary speck of dust from his trouser leg with fastidious precision. "I shall require interviews with all three, naturally. But first, a question of considerably more immediate interest. What was upon the desk?" Graves consulted his notebook, that inevitable refuge of the methodical mind. Letters, several unopened. A ledger, apparently his personal accounts. An inkwell, pen, blotting paper, a small brass bell, rather ornamental. "Nothing of particular significance." "Nothing of particular significance," Whimsy repeated thoughtfully, is precisely the phrase one utters when one has failed to understand what one is examining. The bell, for instance, was Mr. Ashford accustomed to ringing for service whilst in the library? That is, the servants didn't mention. Of course they didn't. One rarely mentions the unremarkable. But I notice the bell is positioned rather too carefully, rather too deliberately, for a man who has just decided to shoot himself. Most suicides, I'm told, are acts of impulse rather than arrangement. They don't tidy their instruments of extinction beforehand. Whimsy moved to the windows, gazing out at the gardens. "These windows, are they locked?" "Both fastened from the inside," Graves confirmed. "We checked thoroughly." "Thorough," Whimsy mused. "How very relentless of you. And yet, I observe that the curtains on the left window are fractionally more closed than those on the right. A draught, perhaps, or something slightly more interesting." He moved to examine the curtains more closely, his fingers running along the heavy velvet with the delicacy of a man appraising silk at a draper's. The movement caused something to flutter to the carpet, a minute thing, easily overlooked, the sort of detail that would never find its way into an official report. "What precisely is that?" Graves asked. Whimsy retrieved the object, a single, almost translucent thread, perhaps 2 inches in length, pale grey in colour. He held it to the light, examining it with an expression of elaborate thoughtfulness. "That," he said slowly, "is either a fragment of theatrical gauze, or I am a Dutchman. Tell me, Inspector, does Mr. Julian Ashford strike you as a man of theatrical inclinations? Did he attend the London theatres? Did he possess amateur dramatic interests?" "Not according to the family. He was, by all accounts, a rather dull man, interested primarily in the estate and his business dealings. Dull men," Whimsy observed, pocketing the thread with the care of a curator acquiring a Gutenberg folio, "are frequently the most interesting, once one troubles to examine them properly." They are like Victorian furniture, apparently straightforward until one discovers the secret compartments. He turned from the window, his expression settling into something approaching businesslike efficiency. I should like to examine the body itself, if the good doctor hasn't already removed it. And then I must speak with the household, particularly with Mr. Harold Ashford, who heard the shot. I'm curious about his hearing, you see, whether it's acute or merely average, and whether he might have heard anything else of interest in the moments preceding. Graves, who had begun the day with the comfortable certainty of a case soon to be closed, found himself increasingly aware that his comfortable certainty was being systematically dismantled. You believe the nephew is involved? I believe, Whimsy said, moving toward the door, that we have yet to determine precisely what we believe. But I suspect, my dear Graves, that before this matter is concluded, we shall all have learned considerably more about the nature of locked doors, stray threads, and the peculiar habits of the left-handed dead. The post-mortem examination, conducted by Dr. Hartwell in what had been converted into a makeshift mortuary in the lodge's eastern study, proved to be an affair of careful observation and minimal revelation. Hartwell was one of those medical practitioners who had learned, through years of experience, that the dead were rarely disposed to elaborate on their final moments with any useful clarity. He presented his findings with the precision of a man reading a railway schedule. Death occurred between 8 and 9 o'clock, he concluded, drawing back the sheet with professional detachment. The bullet entered the right temple at an angle consistent with a self-inflicted wound. Trajectory suggests the barrel was held at approximately 45 degrees. Powder residue on the right hand indicates the weapon was discharged from that hand. No signs of struggle, no defensive wounds. Death would have been relatively instantaneous. And yet, Whimsy observed, standing at a discreet distance from the corpse, the left hand shows considerably more callousing on the fingers than the right. You see the ink stains here on the thumb and forefinger? Unmistakably the marks of a man who writes with his left hand. One doesn't acquire such patterns through mere doodling. Hartwell frowned, as though confronted by evidence of scientific betrayal. I had not paid particular attention to that detail. Details, Whimsy said mildly, are rather the point of your profession, aren't they? Still, no matter. You've done your work adequately. The medical evidence suggests self-destruction. The circumstantial evidence suggests otherwise, a contradiction most interesting. He turned from the body and made his way back through the corridors of Ashford Lodge with the unhurried gait of a man visiting a particularly tedious museum exhibition. The house itself seemed to press down with the accumulated weight of Victorian certainties, heavy furniture, dark paintings, the perpetual odor of beeswax and old money. Somewhere in this fortress of domesticity, Whimsy reflected, lay the seeds of whatever had culminated in Julian Ashford's unlikely demise. Mrs. Crane, the housekeeper, had installed herself in the morning room with the territorial confidence of someone who had held dominion over the household's domestic arrangements for decades. She was a woman of perhaps 60, with the particular sharpness of feature that came from a lifetime of noting every deviation from established routine. Her hands folded and unfolded in her lap with mechanical precision. I can't say as I'm surprised, she began, before Whimsy had properly settled into his chair. Not really, when you think about it. Gentlemen like Mr. Ashford, all those business worries, and then his sister coming to stay last month with her troubles. A man can only bear so much. How very philosophical, Whimsy remarked. And yet, Mrs. Crane, you don't strike me as a woman given to speculation about the mental states of your employers. You seem rather more the type to deal in facts. So let me ask you directly, did Mr. Ashford ever express suicidal inclinations? She hesitated, her fingers stilling momentarily. Not in so many words, sir, but a housekeeper notices things. The way he'd sit in the library of an evening, staring at nothing. The way his correspondence seemed to upset him. What sort of correspondence? I couldn't say, sir. It's not my place to read the master's letters. Admirable discretion, Whimsy said. But you did notice them, I take it? The letters that upset him? Where did they come from? Mrs. Crane's jaw tightened slightly. London, mostly. 1 or 2 with a Scottish postmark. But truly, sir, I couldn't. Tell me instead about the evening of his death. Walk me through the household's movements from dinner onwards. The housekeeper provided a recitation that was clearly well rehearsed, either through repetition to Inspector Graves or through the private rehearsal of the anxious. Dinner had concluded at 7:30. Mr. Ashford had retired to the library at 8 o'clock. Mr. Harold had taken brandy in the drawing-room with his uncle's solicitor, Mr. Pemberton, who was staying the night. Miss Ashford, the master's sister, had complained of a headache and retired early. The servants had begun clearing the dining-room and, by all accounts, had heard nothing unusual until the shot rang out at 9. "And Mr. Harold?" Wimsey prompted. "He heard it clearly? He came into the hall calling for his uncle, sir. Very agitated he was. Agitated because he'd heard a shot, or agitated for other reasons." Mrs. Crane's eyes narrowed slightly. "I couldn't presume to know the gentleman's reasons, sir. Of course not. But you might have observed them. Did Mr. Harold seem surprised by the shot, or did he seem to have been expecting something of the sort?" The housekeeper's silence stretched like pulled taffy. When she finally spoke, her voice had taken on a different quality, something closer to reluctant honesty. "He seemed prepared, if you take my meaning. As though he'd been waiting for something." Wimsey rose from his chair with the fluid grace of a man for whom movement was never an awkwardness. "Thank you, Mrs. Crane. You've been remarkably helpful. One final question. Does the household possess any theatrical properties? Costumes, scenery, that sort of thing?" She stared at him as though he'd suddenly begun speaking in Mandarin. "Theatrical properties, sir? Never mind. N.D. I suspect I already know the answer." He moved toward the door, then paused, turning back with the air of a man who had suddenly recalled something trivial. The bell on the library desk, the brass one. "Has Mr. Ashford been in the habit of using it recently?" "Not that I'm aware, sir. It's been there for years, more decoration than anything." "How very interesting," Wimsey murmured. "One would almost think someone wanted us to notice it particularly. Ring for Mr. Harold Ashford, would you? I believe it's time we had a conversation with the nephew." Harold Ashford arrived in the morning-room with the particular demeanor of a man who had been summoned to an uncertain interview and was attempting to project an air of wounded innocence. He was perhaps 30 years of age, with his uncle's narrow eyes but softer features that suggested a life of fewer moral certainties. His hands bore no ink stains whatsoever, a detail Wimsey noted with the precision of a collector cataloguing specimens. "Lord Peter," Harold began, extending his hand with the nervous enthusiasm of someone who believed social cordiality might somehow ameliorate whatever suspicions lingered. "Inspector Graves mentioned you might wish to speak with me. Dreadful business, all of this. Simply dreadful." "Undoubtedly," Wimsey agreed, shaking the offered hand without apparent enthusiasm. "Your uncle's death must occasion considerable disruption. Tell me, Mr. Ashford, when you heard the shot at 9 o'clock, what precisely were you doing?" Harold settled into a chair with the careful movements of someone acutely conscious of being observed. "I was in the drawing-room with Mr. Pemberton, my uncle's solicitor. We were discussing some matters of business. At 9 in the evening. How admirably industrious. What sort of business?" "Estate matters, primarily. Some investments that Uncle Julian had made. Mr. Pemberton was explaining their current status. And your uncle was aware of this discussion?" "He knew Mr. Pemberton was staying, naturally, but the detailed review was, that is, it seemed better to wait until he'd retired to the library before troubling him with the particulars." Wimsey's eyebrow ascended with the grace of a bird taking flight. "How very considerate of you. And yet one might wonder why your uncle's solicitor would require your presence for such a discussion, unless, of course, you possessed some material interest in these estate matters." "Do you, Mr. Ashford?" Harold's fingers tightened slightly on the arm of his chair. "My uncle and I discussed the possibility of my inheriting certain properties, yes. But that's hardly unusual. Every man with property thinks about succession." "Quite true. Still, I'm curious about the timing. Your uncle shot himself, or so we're told, at 9 o'clock, just as you and Mr. Pemberton were, discussing the disposition of his estate. Convenient that. One might almost imagine someone had arranged matters with theatrical precision. I don't understand what you're implying, Lord Peter." Don't you?" Whimsy rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the gardens with an air of elaborate disinterest. "Let me be rather more direct, then. When you heard the shot, what was your immediate reaction?" Harold hesitated, and in that hesitation lay something that made the air in the room seem to contract slightly. I came into the hall immediately. I called for my uncle." "You came into the hall," Whimsy repeated thoughtfully. "You didn't, for instance, run toward the library? You didn't attempt to ascertain from which direction the sound had originated? The library doors are quite distinctive. One knows the sound of them. Do one?" "How many times have you heard a revolver fired within the library, Mr. Ashford?" None, of course. But the location seemed obvious." Whimsy turned from the window, his eyes fixed on Harold with the intensity of a man examining an interesting entomological specimen. "Let me propose an alternative sequence of events. Let me suggest that you knew precisely where the shot came from because you, or someone acting on your behalf, had arranged for it to occur at that particular moment. Let me suggest further that the business discussion with Mr. Pemberton was itself a staged performance, designed to establish your presence and account for the time." Harold's face had taken on a chalky appearance. "This is outrageous. I had nothing to do with my uncle's death. I didn't suggest you pulled the trigger," Whimsy said quietly. "I'm simply noting that your reaction to a mysterious sound in the night was remarkably prescient. Most people, upon hearing a gunshot in an unfamiliar house, experience a moment of confusion. You experienced certainty. That's rather interesting, don't you think? I don't know what you want from me. I want the truth, Mr. Ashford. But before we pursue that particular phantom, I should like to know about your uncle's correspondence. Mrs. Crane mentioned that letters from London and Scotland had upset him considerably. Were you aware of this correspondence?" Harold's jaw tightened. "I may have noticed he seemed preoccupied. May have, or did. There's a considerable difference between the two states of knowledge." Whimsy resumed his seat, folding his hands with the air of a man settling in for a protracted negotiation. "You see, I'm beginning to construct a rather interesting picture of your uncle's final days. A man receiving distressing letters. A man whose mood deteriorates noticeably. And then, suddenly, within the space of a month, a solicitor is summoned, estate matters are discussed, and your uncle is found dead with a revolver in his right hand. Despite being left-handed as the day is long, that doesn't prove anything." "No," Whimsy agreed, "but it suggests several intriguing possibilities. For instance, it suggests that someone wished your uncle dead and constructed an elaborate scenario to make that death appear self-inflicted. It suggests that this someone had access to the library and knew enough about your uncle's habits to make the staging credible. And it suggests, most interestingly, that this someone believed a locked room and a convenient suicide would be sufficient to deflect serious investigation." He paused, allowing his words to settle like sediment in still water. "What I haven't yet determined is whether you orchestrated this affair yourself or whether you were merely a useful pawn in someone else's game. So I'm going to ask you directly, who else was in the house that evening? Who else might have had access to the library?" Harold's mouth had gone dry. When he spoke, his voice had lost its attempted nonchalance. "My uncle's sister, Miss Ashford. She was here. And there was a visitor, a woman. She came to the side entrance around 8 o'clock. A woman," Whimsy repeated softly. "And did this woman have a name? I don't know who she was. I only saw her briefly. But Uncle Julian seemed to know her. He took her directly to the library." The morning room fell silent, save for the ticking of the mantelpiece clock, that faithful keeper of moments, that relentless recorder of time's passage. Whimsy rose with deliberate slowness, his expression now entirely unreadable. "How very helpful you've become, Mr. Ashford. I believe I shall now speak with your uncle's sister. She may prove considerably more illuminating than you have been." Miss Catherine Ashford occupied the upper sitting room with the territorial authority of a woman who had established herself as a permanent fixture despite her status as a visitor. She was perhaps 55 years of age, with the particular bearing of someone who had once possessed considerable beauty and had never entirely forgiven the passage of time for its thievery. Her black dress was impeccable, morning attire donned with the swift efficiency of the prepared, and her expression when Whimsy entered suggested she had anticipated this interview with something approaching resignation. "Lord Peter," she said, rising from her chair with the formal courtesy of the old school, "I confess I was wondering when you might call upon me. Harold, I presume, has been providing you with his own peculiar interpretation of events?" "Mr. Harold has been remarkably forthcoming," Whimsy replied, accepting her offer of a chair with the grace of one accustomed to such domestic rituals, "though I notice his account contained rather more speculation than fact. Perhaps you might redress the balance by providing me with something closer to the truth." Catherine settled back into a chair with the deliberate movements of a woman taking a calculated risk. "The truth, Lord Peter, is considerably more complicated than my nephew would have you believe. But before I elaborate, I should like to understand precisely what you've already discerned. A man with your reputation doesn't require much assistance reaching correct conclusions." "How refreshingly direct," Whimsy observed. "Very well. I deduce that your brother received correspondence of a disturbing nature. Letters that arrived from London and Scotland with sufficient regularity to constitute a pattern. These letters upset him considerably, which suggests they contained information he had been hoping to avoid. I further deduce that someone, a woman, according to Mr. Harold, arrived at this house yesterday evening and was admitted directly to the library, where your brother subsequently met his end. The murder. R was staged as suicide, which suggests a high degree of planning and familiarity with your brother's habits. And finally, I deduce that you possess knowledge of all this and have, until this moment, chosen to remain silent. Shall I continue, or have I sufficiently demonstrated the adequacy of my reasoning?" Catherine regarded him with an expression that suggested something between admiration and resignation. "You're correct, of course, though I suspect your conclusions, while accurate in their particulars, miss the emotional architecture of the situation entirely. My brother, Lord Peter, was not a good man. That doesn't justify what occurred, but it contextualizes it." "I'm listening," Whimsy said, and there was something in his tone that suggested he genuinely was. "Julian," Catherine began, choosing her words with the care of someone assembling a particularly delicate narrative, "was involved in certain business dealings that extended considerably beyond the boundaries of conventional propriety. Nothing criminal, precisely. He was too cautious for genuine illegality, but ethically questionable at best. He had invested in ventures that displaced families, foreclosed on properties, acquired land through means that were technically legal but morally questionable, and one of these ventures," Whimsy interjected gently, "resulted in consequences he had failed to anticipate." "There was a woman," Catherine continued, her voice dropping slightly. "Years ago, before I came to live here, a young woman who worked as a governess at a neighboring estate. Julian pursued her, with the particular determination of a man accustomed to acquiring whatever he desired. She was susceptible to his attentions. He could be charming when the mood took him, and she was young and vulnerable." Whimsy remained silent, sensing that Catherine had arrived at the crux of her narrative. She became pregnant, Catherine said flatly. Julian denied paternity, dismissed her from her position, and she disappeared into the London slums. The child, a daughter, was born and raised in circumstances of considerable hardship. My brother never acknowledged the matter again. He seemed somehow to have erased it from his consciousness entirely. "And this daughter," Whimsy said softly, "was the woman who arrived at the side entrance yesterday evening." "She was. Her mother died 10 years ago, but not before providing the daughter with certain documentation, letters primarily. Proof of Julian's involvement, his promises, his subsequent denials. The daughter began researching her father's current circumstances approximately 8 months ago. She wrote to him, initially with requests for acknowledgement. When those were ignored, the letters became increasingly pointed. She demanded recognition, compensation, some form of restitution for the life she had been forced to lead, and your brother refused, categorically. He instructed his solicitors to have any further correspondence redirected. He was preparing, I suspect, to have her investigated, to discover some means of discrediting her claims. Catherine's hands had begun to tremble slightly. I became aware of the situation through his solicitors, who felt obliged to brief me regarding certain aspects of his affairs. I wrote to the girl, for she is hardly more than that, despite her age, and we established a correspondence. I felt that someone should acknowledge her existence, her suffering. And so you arranged for her to come here. I did, not to harm him, Lord Peter. I swear to you, I did not anticipate violence. I believed a confrontation, a face-to-face encounter, might precipitate some form of resolution. I hoped he might finally acknowledge his daughter, that he might be forced to confront the consequences of his actions. Whimsy rose and moved to the window, his expression thoughtful. What was her name? Eleanor, Catherine said quietly. Eleanor Ashford, though she took her mother's surname professionally. Eleanor Vane. The name hung in the air between them like a note struck on a violin, vibrating with implications. Whimsy stood silently, his fingers unconsciously stroking his jaw in that peculiar gesture that indicated his mind was assembling information like a chess master contemplating a particularly intricate endgame. "And where," he asked finally, "is Miss Eleanor now?" Catherine's silence was itself an answer, heavy, complicated, pregnant with consequences. She fled, Lord Peter. After hearing the shot, she panicked and ran into the darkness. "I don't know where she went." Whimsy turned from the window, and his expression had shifted into something altogether more serious than his previous urbanity. "Then I suggest, Miss Ashford, that we locate her before Inspector Graves concludes that she murdered her father in cold blood and orchestrates her arrest on rather more conclusive evidence than circumstantial speculation can provide. Because if we don't find her first, I suspect the next act of this tragedy will prove considerably more difficult to resolve." The Sussex Constabulary, when confronted with the news that their presumed suicide case now contained a second suspect of considerably more obvious motive, demonstrated the particular paralysis that seizes organizations designed for routine rather than complexity. Inspector Graves had been preparing his report with the satisfaction of a man whose investigation would soon reach its convenient conclusion. The revelation that a previously unknown daughter of the deceased existed and had been present at the scene introduced complications of the sort that required additional paperwork and, worse, the possibility of appearing incompetent before his superiors. "You're certain she was here?" Graves demanded, his voice taking on the sharp edge of accusation. "And no one thought to mention this woman before now?" "Miss Ashford only just informed me," Whimsy replied with the unflappable calm of one untroubled by bureaucratic distress. "And Mr. Harold, I suspect, had been hoping the matter would resolve itself without further complications. People do tend toward such wishful thinking when murder is involved." "This changes everything," Graves muttered, already reaching for his telephone. "We need to put out a description, alert the station." "Before you do that," Whimsy interjected, "I should like to conduct a search of the lodge." Eleanor Vane didn't simply vanish into the ether. She fled in panic, which means she was thinking tactically but not strategically. She would have sought shelter first, concealment second. "Has anyone examined the grounds thoroughly?" "The grounds are extensive," Graves said defensively. 30 acres of woodland and gardens. A woman could hide indefinitely if she knew the terrain." True, but Eleanor Vane was raised in London slums, which suggests she would gravitate toward enclosed spaces rather than open countryside. The human mind, when frightened, seeks the familiar. What familiar enclosed spaces does this house provide? Graves blinked, his expression suggesting he was being asked to contemplate a particularly obscure mathematical theorem. "The servants' quarters? The cellars? How very metropolitan of you," Whimsy said. "But I was thinking of something rather more theatrical. Tell me, does Ashford Lodge possess a priest hole, a servants' passageway, some architectural quirk left over from previous centuries?" It was Catherine who answered, her voice carrying the weight of long-accumulated household knowledge. "The library has a connecting passage to the master's study. It's been sealed for decades. My father had the door covered with bookcases after the war, when servants were becoming difficult to retain. But Eleanor would have seen it when she was in the library with Julian. She was quite observant." Whimsy's expression shifted into something approaching satisfaction. How very helpful. And this passage, it leads where precisely? To the study, as I said. And from there, a secondary passage that connects to the upper landing. It's how the master could move about the house without encountering servants in the corridors. Within 10 minutes, Whimsy had assembled a small party consisting of himself, Inspector Graves, and Bunter, who had materialized from the automobile with the sort of prescient timing that suggested either supernatural awareness or merely decades of practice in anticipating his employer's requirements. They made their way to the library, which now seemed to have taken on an entirely different character, no longer simply a death scene, but rather the focal point of a much more intricate geometry of escape and concealment. The bookcases that concealed the passageway yielded to pressure with a reluctance born of decades of disuse. Behind them lay a narrow door of considerable age, its paint peeling away in flakes like the skin of some ancient reptile. Whimsy produced a small torch from his waistcoat pocket, another item that suggested he traveled perpetually prepared for minor adventures, and pushed the door inward. The passage beyond was precisely what one might expect of such architectural contraptions, narrow, musty, lined with the accumulated detritus of disuse. Cobwebs adorned the corners with the industriousness of spiders who had owned the space for decades. The air smelled of old plaster and forgotten history. "Miss Vane?" Whimsy called out, his voice carrying the tone of one addressing a particule. "Lally skittish animal. My name is Lord Peter Whimsy. I'm not with the police, and I'm not here to arrest you. I'm here because I believe you've been catastrophically misunderstood." For a moment there was nothing but the settling of ancient wood and the distant sound of wind in the eaves. Then, from deeper within the passage came a sound, a sharp intake of breath, quickly stifled. "I suspect," Whimsy continued, his voice maintaining its conversational tone, "that you came to this house yesterday with certain intentions regarding your father. You hoped, perhaps, for acknowledgement. You hoped he might listen, might understand, might demonstrate some modicum of paternal conscience. Instead, I imagine you found him precisely as he was, dismissive, contemptuous, utterly unwilling to acknowledge either your existence or your suffering. How did you—" A voice emerged from the darkness, female, controlled despite evident emotion. "Because, Miss Vane, I have encountered your father's type before. Men who have spent their entire lives compartmentalizing their actions, convincing themselves that mere financial advantage absolves all moral responsibility. They are, without exception, utterly predictable in their defensive reactions." Whimsy advanced carefully, his torch casting grotesque shadows on the narrow walls. "What I suspect happened is that you confronted him. An argument ensued. Perhaps he was threatening to have you arrested for extortion. Perhaps he was simply being obscene. And at some point during this confrontation, someone, and I do not believe it was you, decided that Julian Ashford had become inconvenient. Eleanor Vane emerged from the shadow like a figure stepping out of a particularly grim Victorian photograph. She was perhaps 30 years of age, with her father's narrow eyes but her mother's softer features. She was holding the brass bell from the desk as T. If it were a weapon, he was going to have me committed, she said, her voice trembling with barely controlled rage. He said I was delusional, that I would be locked away in an asylum within the week. He said no one would believe me, that his solicitors would ensure I was declared insane and institutionalized. And then the shot rang out, Whimsy said softly. And you panicked and ran. I didn't kill him, Eleanor said desperately. You must believe me. He was alive when I left the room. He was alive. Whimsy lowered the torch, his expression shifting into something approaching sympathy. I do believe you, Miss Vane, which means someone else was in that library, concealed or waiting. Someone who killed your father and then stage-managed his death to appear self-inflicted, confident, I suspect, that the appearance of a mysterious woman would be sufficient to direct suspicion away from the genuine architect of his demise. He turned back toward the passage entrance, where Inspector Graves stood with his mouth slightly agape. Inspector, I believe it's time we had a rather more candid conversation with Mr. Harold Ashford. And I suspect you should also summon Mr. Pemberton, the solicitor. I have a theory regarding the disposition of Julian Ashford's estate that I suspect will prove considerably more illuminating than anything we've discovered so far. Mr. Pemberton, when reassembled in the library alongside his former client's corpse and the increasingly bewildered Inspector Graves, demonstrated the particular composure of a man whose professional existence had equipped him to confront almost any social awkwardness. He was perhaps 60 years of age, with the soft features of someone who had spent decades negotiating rather than litigating, and his expression suggested he had anticipated something of this nature with the resignation of a man watching an inevitable catastrophe unfold in slow motion. "I should warn you, Lord Peter," Pemberton said carefully, settling into a chair with the deliberate movements of one preparing for a protracted deposition, "that solicitor-client privilege may prevent me from providing certain information." "How very cautious of you," Whimsy replied. "And yet, I suspect that privilege becomes considerably less relevant when your client is deceased and when your involvement in his death becomes a matter of criminal inquiry. Tell me, Mr. Pemberton, when precisely did Mr. Harold Ashford approach you regarding the modification of his uncle's will?" The solicitor's eyes narrowed fractionally. "I'm not certain I understand your question. Then, allow me to clarify. Julian Ashford was a man of considerable property and modest personal affection. He had no legitimate heir, his sister was settled independently, and his nephew was, by all accounts, a source of perpetual disappointment. Yet, within the past month, Harold Ashford suddenly began discussing estate matters with you, discussing them with such urgency that you made the considerable journey to Sussex specifically to review those discussions with the deceased. Either Mr. Ashford experienced an unexpected financial crisis requiring immediate remedy, or someone was applying pressure for the rapid alteration of testamentary arrangements." Pemberton's silence stretched like pulled taffy, thin and fragile. "Let me propose an alternative narrative," Whimsy continued, his voice taking on the quality of a man reciting a particularly satisfying theorem. "Harold Ashford, nephew and dependent upon an uncle of moderate means but obstinate disposition, conceived a plan. He would murder his uncle and make it appear as suicide. The evidence seemed overwhelming: a locked room, a revolver, apparent motive in the form of business worries. What could be simpler? And yet, Harold required assistance. He required someone with access to the household, someone with motive of their own, someone who could move about the corridors without suspicion. That would be me, I suppose?" Pemberton asked dryly. "No," Whimsy said. "That would be neither of you, actually. Which brings me to the truly interesting element of this affair, the theatrical thread I discovered caught in the library curtains. A theatrical gauze, Mr. Pemberton, the sort of thing used in stage productions, but also the sort of thing one might use to create an optical illusion. Tell me, have you ever attended the theatre?" "Occasionally," Pemberton replied, his tone suggesting he was rapidly reassessing the situation. "And have you ever observed how stage fog is created? How curtains and gauze can obscure a performer's entrance or exit? How our audience can be made to believe someone has vanished when they have merely moved through carefully positioned staging?" Whimsy rose and moved toward the desk, his movements deliberately theatrical. "What occurred in this library yesterday evening was precisely such a theatrical performance. Harold Ashford didn't enter through the door. You did, Mr. Pemberton. You entered shortly after Eleanor Vane had departed, carrying with you the revolver that had been removed from this desk by Harold hours earlier. You found Julian Ashford in a state of considerable agitation, frightened, perhaps even contemplating actual suicide. But you couldn't rely on that. So instead, you shot him, with his own revolver, using your right hand and positioning the weapon in his right hand before departure. This is preposterous," Pemberton said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "Is it? Then explain the staged curtains. Explain why someone would position theatrical gauze across the library windows. Explain why the brass bell was positioned with such deliberate precision on the desk, as though placed there specifically to draw attention." Harold Ashford appeared in the library doorway, his face ashen. "I don't know what you're talking about. Mr. Pemberton was with me when the shot was fired. Mr. Pemberton, Whimsy interrupted, was creating an alibi for himself through the simple expedient of ensuring multiple witnesses could confirm his presence in the drawing room. But people can move more swiftly than one might imagine, particularly when motivated by substantial financial incentive. Tell me, gentlemen, what was the arrangement? Did you promise Mr. Pemberton a portion of the estate? Did you offer him remuneration from the inheritance? Harold's face crumpled, then hardened into something ugly. He approached me. He said he could arrange matters. He said Uncle Julian's death would be ruled suicide and that I would inherit everything. He demanded £50,000 from the estate as compensation. £50,000, Whimsy repeated thoughtfully, a tidy sum, sufficient to ensure comfort and security for life. And yet, Mr. Pemberton, I suspect there was another element to your motivation entirely. Eleanor Vane arrived at this house yesterday, bearing documentary evidence of Julian Ashford's youthful transgression, evidence that, had it become public, would have destroyed his reputation and potentially resulted in legal action regarding the legitimacy of his will. As his solicitor, you knew this. You knew that Eleanor Vane represented an existential threat to the estate's orderly division. Pemberton had gone very pale. I did what was necessary to protect the estate. You did what was necessary to protect your commission. Whimsy corrected coldly. You murdered a man to prevent a legal complication. You staged his death as suicide to deflect investigation. And you were prepared to permit an innocent young woman, a woman with legitimate grievances, to be arrested for your crime. The woman had no legitimate claim, Pemberton said, his voice taking on a desperate quality. She was born in sin, the product of your client's lack of moral constraint, Whimsy finished. And yet, somehow, her bastard status seemed sufficient justification for murder in your estimation. How very convenient for the mechanisms of social propriety that they can be invoked to justify almost any crime. Inspector Graves, who had been following this exchange with the intensity of a man watching a particularly intricate chess match, finally found his voice. You're under arrest, Pemberton, for the murder of Julian Ashford. As constables led the solicitor away, his earlier composure dissolving into desperate protestations of innocence, Whimsy turned to observe Harold Ashford's expression. The nephew's face had taken on the particular quality of a man realizing that his conspiracy had been not merely discovered, but definitively dismantled. As for you, Mr. Ashford, Whimsy said quietly, you are an accomplice to murder. Your cooperation in establishing the truth may affect the severity of your sentence, but it will not alter the essential fact that you conspired to kill your uncle for financial gain. I suggest you contemplate that reality rather carefully before the magistrate. The drawing room at Ashford Lodge had taken on the peculiar atmosphere of a space where profound disorder had been carefully swept beneath conventional furnishings, as though the room itself was complicit in maintaining appearances, despite the eruption of genuine chaos. Eleanor Vane sat with Catherine Ashford, the two women united by a relationship that had begun in secret correspondence and had now been forged, through tragedy and revelation, into something approaching familial recognition. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she accepted tea from a servant who studiously avoided meeting her eyes. A servant who, Whimsy noted, had clearly absorbed the household's collective discomfort regarding the legitimacy of this unexpected daughter. What will happen to her? Eleanor asked, her gaze fixed on the teacup without appearing to register its presence. Eleanor Vane, I mean, the woman everyone believes murdered her father. Will she be charged? Miss Vane, Whimsy replied gently, will face no charges whatsoever. Inspector Graves, once he concluded his investigation with somewhat more rigor than he initially demonstrated, determined that her presence at the scene, while unfortunate, does not constitute evidence of culpability. She fled in panic, which is the entirely natural response of someone discovering a corpse in circumstances she cannot explain. The evidence against Mr. Pemberton is considerably more substantial. His movements can be traced, his motive clearly established, and his access to the murder weapon definitively proven. But she fled, Eleanor protested. Surely that suggests guilt. To the untrained mind, perhaps, Whimsy acknowledged. But consider the psychological dimensions of the situation. You had just experienced the most profound rejection imaginable from a man you had journeyed considerable distance to confront. A man who had threatened you with institutionalization, with legal action, with erasure from any legitimate acknowledgement. And then, unexpectedly, you heard a gunshot. In that moment, your primary instinct would not have been rational analysis, but rather self-preservation. You ran because your mind, quite sensibly, had concluded that remaining in that house would result in your arrest for a crime you had not committed. Catherine reached across and took Eleanor's hand, a gesture of connection that seemed to transcend the peculiar social complications of their sudden kinship. "Julian was a dreadful man," she said quietly. "I say this as his sister, and with the knowledge that speaking ill of the dead is conventionally discouraged. But he was dreadful. He lived his entire life convinced that his financial position absolved him of all moral responsibility. He treated people, particularly women, as though they existed primarily to accommodate his desires, and then to disappear conveniently when those desires had been satisfied. Which is precisely," Whimsy interjected, "why Mr. Pemberton perceived your arrival as a genuine threat. You represented, Miss Eleanor, the embodied consequence of your father's actions, the lived reality that his casual cruelty had produced. To a solicitor of Mr. Pemberton's conventional mindset, you were not merely a complication, you were an obscenity that required removal. Whimsy Ross." And moved to the window, gazing out at the gardens where afternoon light had begun its slow decline toward evening. "What fascinates me about this affair," he continued, his voice taking on the quality of a man engaged in philosophical speculation, "is precisely how thoroughly it demonstrates the mechanisms by which society permits its own corruption. Mr. Pemberton was not a criminal by temperament or predisposition. He was a man of education, position, and respectability, yet he became capable of murder because the situation presented itself in precisely the right configuration: financial incentive, social complication, and the convenient availability of a ready-made scapegoat." "Are you suggesting," Catherine asked carefully, "that we are all potential murderers given the correct circumstances?" "Not all," Whimsy replied, "but more than we care to acknowledge. The criminal impulse requires no particular genius or depravity. It requires only opportunity, motivation, and the capacity to convince oneself that one's actions are justified, that one is, in fact, acting on behalf of order, rather than in violation of it. Mr. Pemberton murdered your brother because he had convinced himself that preventing scandal was equivalent to preserving justice. How very convenient for those who wish to commit murder while maintaining the illusion of righteousness." The clock on the mantelpiece chimed 4 o'clock, a sound that seemed to mark the formal conclusion of the investigation's active phase. Inspector Graves had departed 2 hours earlier, carrying with him the documentation necessary to prosecute both Harold Ashford and Mr. Pemberton. The Sussex Constabulary would handle the procedural mechanics of arrest, interrogation, and trial preparation. Whimsy's role, as he had always understood it, was not to provide punishment, but merely to illuminate truth, to construct from the chaos of contradictory evidence and human motivation a narrative sufficiently coherent to permit the machinery of justice to function. "You should know," Whimsy said, addressing Eleanor directly, "that your father did leave a will. The document was executed approximately 18 months ago, before Mr. Pemberton's involvement in this affair. That will makes no provision whatsoever for you, nor for your mother's memory, nor for any acknowledgement of the relationship that produced you. However, the estate being now entailed to the Crown through the failure of legitimate heirs, given that Harold Ashford will be imprisoned and thus unable to inherit, there are certain provisions made for the maintenance of the property. I suspect it may be possible to direct a portion of those provisions toward the establishment of a modest settlement for yourself, nothing adequate to compensate for your suffering naturally, but sufficient, perhaps, to permit you to live with somewhat greater comfort than your previous circumstances have allowed." Eleanor's eyes had filled with tears, though whether from gratitude, grief, or the accumulated exhaustion of emotional trauma, Whimsy could not determine with certainty. Catherine squeezed her hand more firmly, and between the two women passed something that transcended conventional relationship, a recognition of shared suffering and the tentative possibility of redemption through familial connection. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered. "I don't know what else to say. I came here expecting nothing but rejection. I received murder instead. And now, unexpectedly, I seem to have acquired something that feels almost like family." Whimsy inclined his head with a formal courtesy that masked whatever emotional response he may have experienced. "The human heart," he observed, "is quite often more generous than the human mind permits it to be. Your presence here, I constitute disruption, but it need not constitute tragedy. That, I believe, is sufficient resolution for one day." He collected his coat and hat with the deliberate movements of a man preparing for departure. Bunter materialized from the corridor with the prescient efficiency that suggested he had been monitoring his employer's movements with something approaching supernatural attentiveness. "We shall return to London this evening," Whimsy announced. "The Sussex countryside is all very well in its fashion, but I find myself craving the particular corruptions of urban civilization. Inspector Graves has proven himself adequate to the concluding formalities. Our presence here is no longer required." The journey back to London proceeded with the smooth efficiency that characterized all of Whimsy's travels, the Lagonda consuming the Sussex roads with mechanical precision, while its passenger maintained that particular silence which suggested his mind was engaged in the final assembly of conclusions rather than in conventional conversation. Bunter, from his position in the rear seat, had produced a thermos of coffee and some sandwiches with the sort of anticipatory foresight that suggested he had been managing his employer's requirements for so many years that prediction had become indistinguishable from prescience. It was not until they had crossed the threshold into London proper, that particular geography where gaslight replaced daylight and the streets themselves seemed to pulse with accumulated human complexity, that Whimsy finally broke his silence. "You observe, Bunter," he remarked, his eyes fixed on the street ahead, "that we have just concluded an investigation wherein the guilty party was not, in any conventional sense, a criminal. Pemberton was a respectable solicitor, a man of education and professional standing, a participant in all the social mechanisms that supposedly distinguish civilization from barbarism. And yet he committed premeditated murder with the calm precision of a man arranging a particularly routine legal transaction." "Indeed, sir," Bunter replied, his tone suggesting he had anticipated this particular philosophical meditation. "If I might be permitted to observe, sir, the gentleman seemed to regard the crime rather as a form of professional duty than as a violation of law." "Precisely," Whimsy said, turning the automobile into Piccadilly with the casual confidence of a man who viewed London traffic as merely another aesthetic component of urban existence. He had convinced himself that he was acting as a guardian of social order, that Eleanor Vane's legitimacy was itself a sort of disorder requiring correction. One sees this continually in history, men committing atrocities while maintaining the absolute conviction that they are preserving something essential. It is perhaps the most insidious form of evil, because it requires no self-awareness, no acknowledgement of moral compromise. One simply applies the conventional values of one's class and calls it justice. The Lagonda drew to a halt before his Piccadilly flat, and Whimsy emerged with the careful movements of a man whose body had absorbed considerable hours of driving without complaint. The evening had taken on that particular quality of London winter, the fog not yet sufficiently dense to obscure the street lamps, but thick enough to render them halos of luminescence against the darkness. "Sir," Bunter ventured, as they ascended the stairs toward the flat, "if I might inquire, what do you believe will transpire regarding Miss Eleanor Vane? Her situation remains, if I may be permitted to observe, considerably uncertain. Her situation remains, as you correctly note, uncertain but considerably improved from this time yesterday," Whimsy replied, unlocking the flat door with the precise key from his collection. "Catherine Ashford, I suspect, will prove considerably more sympathetic to her existence than her brother ever could have been. The inheritance complications will eventually resolve themselves. and Miss Eleanor will gradually discover that bastard status, while socially unfortunate, is not in itself fatal to the construction of a meaningful life. The primary consequence of her father's death will likely be liberation rather than tragedy. The flat received them with that particular comfort that comes from habitual occupation, the familiar arrangement of furniture, the libraries ranked with books, the overall sense of a space that had absorbed its inhabitant's personality so thoroughly that it had become almost an extension of his consciousness. Whimsy settled into his customary chair with the satisfaction of a man returning to the appropriate coordinates of his existence. "Fetch me the files on the Ashford matter, would you, Bunter?" he requested. "I should like to review my notes while the affair remains sufficiently fresh in memory. There are certain elements I should like to reconsider. The precise timing of Pemberton's departure from the drawing room, the mechanism by which the theatrical gauze was introduced, the question of whether Harold Ashford's complicity extended beyond mere accessorial involvement. As Bunter departed to retrieve the necessary documents, Whimsy found himself reflecting on the curious paradox of his profession. Each case that concluded left behind not satisfaction but rather a peculiar hollow feeling, the knowledge that his intervention had merely applied judicial mechanisms to symptoms rather than addressing the deeper pathologies that produced such symptoms. Eleanor Vane would recover, perhaps even prosper. Harold Ashford would be imprisoned. Pemberton would face trial and almost certai. Enlai conviction. The machinery of justice would grind forward, producing its prescribed outcomes. And yet, Julian Ashford would remain dead, the consequence not of any genuine moral evolution, but merely of the particular configuration of human weakness and circumstance that had conspired to produce his demise. The fundamental conditions that had permitted a man to pursue a young woman, abandon his responsibility, and then spend decades convinced that such abandonment absolved him of all moral consequence. Those conditions would persist. The next Pemberton might exercise more caution, but he would certainly exist. Whimsy rose and moved to his bookshelf, extracting a volume of Jacobean drama with the reverence of a man retrieving scripture. He opened it to the marked passage and read aloud, "We are the stuff that dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep." The observation seemed to capture something essential about the affair. The curious dream logic by which people constructed their rationalizations, the ultimate insignificance of individual moral compromise when examined against the vast indifference of existence itself. It was a meditation that might have descended into nihilism had Whimsy not possessed that particular corrective influence that prevented him from surrendering entirely to philosophical despair. "Bunter," he called out, as his manservant returned with the requested files, "you'll note that we have resolved a murder while simultaneously failing to resolve the conditions that produced it. Is this, do you suppose, the appropriate extent of my professional responsibility?" Bunter's expression suggested he had fielded this particular question with sufficient frequency, that he possessed a prepared response. "If I might observe, sir, the responsibility of any individual extends only to those matters within the scope of their direct influence. You have illuminated truth, sir. The application of that truth to the transformation of society at large exceeds the reasonable boundaries of your obligation." "How very comforting," Whimsy replied dryly, "and how very inadequate. Still, one must content oneself with minor accomplishments in a world constructed to resist fundamental improvement. Fetch me a brandy, would you? I find myself in need of philosophical anesthesia." The brandy proved to be precisely the philosophical anesthetic that Whimsy had prescribed for himself, its particular warmth spreading through his consciousness with the benign inevitability of the aging process itself. He settled more deeply into his chair, the files regarding the Ashford affair arranged on the small table beside him, with the meticulous organization that suggested Bunter had anticipated this precise moment of contemplative review. The flat had taken on that quality of comfortable silence that exists between two people whose mutual understanding has transcended the necessity for constant verbal affirmation. It was perhaps an hour later, as the evening had progressed toward the particular hour when London's streets began to empty of their daytime populations, that the telephone rang with the imperious tone of an instrument accustomed to immediate obedience. Bunter answered from the extension in the hallway, and Whimsy could hear the distant murmur of conversation before his manservant appeared in the doorway with an expression suggesting he bore tidings of moderate consequence. "Inspector Parker, sir," Bunter announced. "He requests your presence at Scotland Yard. A matter, he indicates, of some urgency regarding the Ashford conclusions." Whimsy set aside his brandy with visible reluctance. Did Parker specify the nature of this urgency? One hopes he hasn't discovered that Pemberton possessed an accomplice we somehow overlooked. "In our investigations," the inspector was reticent regarding particulars, sir. "However, he mentioned that a confession of considerable complexity has been forthcoming, one which he believes may benefit from your analytical perspective." "How typical of Parker," Whimsy observed, rising with the fluid grace of a man who had learned to regard unexpected summonses as merely another component of his professional existence. "One solves a murder with meticulous precision, exposes the guilty party with irrefutable logic, and yet Scotland Yard continues to present one with additional complications. One begins to suspect they deliberately construct fresh mysteries in order to justify their continued employment." The drive to Scotland Yard proceeded through streets, now rendered picturesque by the encroaching fog, that particular London phenomenon that transformed mundane geography into something approaching romantic Gothic, while simultaneously making navigation considerably more treacherous. Parker awaited him in his office with the expression of a man who had been wrestling with a problem of considerable conceptual difficulty and had finally concluded that external consultation was his only viable option. "Peter," Parker began, dispensing with formality, as his friendship with Whimsy permitted. "We have Pemberton in custody, and he's been remarkably forthcoming regarding his involvement in the Ashford murder. Too forthcoming, actually, which is what troubles me. He's provided a confession so detailed, so comprehensive, that it almost feels rehearsed, as though he's prepared this narrative in advance." "Which suggests," Whimsy said, settling into a chair across from Parker's desk, "that Pemberton anticipated either arrest or the necessity of providing an explanation. Did he demonstrate any surprise when confronted with the evidence? Any indication that he believed himself safe FR? Discovery. None whatsoever. It's as though he expected you to arrive at precisely the conclusions you did. He seems almost relieved, Peter. That's what unsettles me most. A guilty man should demonstrate at least some vestigial anxiety regarding his prospects. Pemberton merely seems grateful that the affair has finally reached its inevitable conclusion." Whimsy's expression shifted into something more focused, his earlier philosophical detachment giving way to active intellectual engagement. "That suggests a man acting from psychological desperation rather than mere financial motivation. Tell me, has Pemberton elaborated on his relationship with Julian Ashford? Was it merely that of solicitor and client, or was there something more complicated beneath that conventional arrangement?" Parker consulted his notes, turning pages with the methodical care of a man who had learned to value precision in documentation. "Pemberton claims that Ashford had been his client for nearly 20 years. More significantly, he indicates that Ashford had been engaged in various ethically questionable transactions for the duration of that period, and that Pemberton had become, through the accumulation of years and complications, essentially trapped in complicity. He states that Ashford had begun to make increasingly unreasonable demands, that he was attempting to coerce Pemberton into actions of dubious legality, and Eleanor Vane's arrival presented an opportunity for Pemberton to escape this trap, Whimsy mused, his fingers resuming their characteristic stroking of his jaw. By removing Ashford, Pemberton could eliminate not only his primary source of moral corruption, but also the financial dependency that had bound him to his unscrupulous client. Except that such logic contains a fundamental flaw, doesn't it? Killing Ashford would not have relieved Pemberton of his previous complicity in unethical practices. If anything, it would have compounded his legal jeopardy considerably. "That's precisely what I concluded," Parker agreed. "So why would a man of Pemberton's evident intelligence and education commit a murder that could only worsen his circumstances?" "Because," Whimsy said slowly, rising from his chair and moving to the window overlooking the yard's courtyard, Pemberton had reached a state of psychological extremity where the act itself had become divorced from rational calculation. He was operating not from logical assessment, but from a kind of desperate moral clarity, the conviction that removing Ashford would constitute some form of expiation for his previous moral compromises. In psychology, such states are occasionally termed salvation through transgression. That's rather abstract for a murder investigation, Parker observed somewhat dryly. True, but it explains why Pemberton has proven so cooperative with his interrogation. He wants to establish, as comprehensively as possible, that his act was undertaken for moral reasons rather than financial ones. He wants the world to understand that he killed Ashford not from greed, but from the accumulated weight of having facilitated a dreadful man's dreadful activities for 2 decades. Parker set down his pen with the gesture of a man abandoning a problem he could not solve through conventional means. So you believe his confession? You believe that his motivation was essentially moral rather than mercenary? I believe, Whimsy replied carefully, that human motivation is rarely singular in nature. Pemberton was undoubtedly motivated partially by financial consideration. £50,000 is not an insignificant sum. But he was also motivated by guilt, by the accumulated psychological burden of facilitating Ashford's exploitation, by the sudden opportunity to convert himself from a accomplice to executor of justice. Whether such self-transformation is genuine or merely elaborate self-deception remains, I suspect, a matter of philosophical interpretation rather than objective fact. Which means, Parker said slowly, that we have convicted a man of murder whose guilt is legally incontrovertible, but whose moral culpability remains genuinely ambiguous. Welcome, my dear Parker, Whimsy said, returning to his chair with the satisfaction of a man who had finally articulated a truth that others had been circling without quite grasping, to the essential paradox of criminal law. We construct our systems of justice based on the assumption that guilt and innocence exist as binary conditions, that murder is murder regardless of its psychological underpinnings. And yet, the human soul rarely cooperates with such convenient categorizations. Pemberton is guilty of killing Ashford. He is also, in some genuine sense, guilty of finally acting against the moral corruption he had previously enabled. Which of these guilts is the more significant remains, I fear, a question that exceeds the legitimate scope of judicial determination. Parker's silence stretched across the interval between them like a physical object, tangible in its weight and significance. The inspector had spent sufficient years in Whimsy's company to recognize when his friend had articulated a conclusion that transcended the boundaries of conventional police procedure, and thus exceeded the legitimate scope of bureaucratic response. He lit a cigarette with the careful movements of a man who required the mechanical ritual to organize his thoughts. "What do you propose we do with this ambiguity?" Parker asked finally. "The case will go to trial. Pemberton will be convicted. The evidence is conclusive, but the jury will hear his explanation, will perhaps perceive in his actions something approaching. Noble sacrifice, rather than mere murder. There's a risk that his sentence might be considerably more lenient than the crime would typically warrant, which is, I suspect, precisely the outcome Pemberton anticipated when he orchestrated his confession with such theatrical precision," Whimsy replied. "He has constructed a narrative in which he is neither monster nor hero, but rather a man caught between competing moral imperatives. The courts may convict him of murder, but he has already convicted himself of far more serious offenses: complicity, enablement, moral cowardice. In that sense, the legal system's punishment becomes almost secondary to the psychological reckoning he has already undergone. That's remarkably generous interpretation for a man who attempted to frame an innocent woman for his crime," Parker observed with pointed directness. "True," Whimsy acknowledged. Eleanor Vane's potential imprisonment would have troubled Pemberton not at all, provided it served his own purposes. There is no redemption in that calculation, merely convenience masquerading as principle. Still, one must acknowledge that Pemberton's ultimate confession, regardless of its psychological origins, has prevented precisely that miscarriage of justice. He could have maintained his elaborate suicide staging. Instead, he chose to unburden himself of the truth. Whether that choice originated from genuine conscience or merely from the exhaustion of maintaining an elaborate fiction remains, I confess, beyond my capacity to determine with certainty. Whimsy rose from his chair and moved toward Parker's window, gazing down at the yard's courtyard where constables moved about their various tasks with the purposeful efficiency of men who did not spend their evenings contemplating moral ambiguities. The fundamental difficulty with criminal investigation, Parker, is that it assumes guilt and innocence to be comprehensible categories. But human action, when examined with sufficient rigor, reveals itself to be vastly more complicated than such binary classification permits. Pemberton is guilty of murder. He is also guilty of moral complicity in 2 decades of exploitation. He is perhaps even guilty of a kind of inverted nobility in finally acting against the man he had previously enabled. The law can address the first guilt. The others will likely remain forever beyond the legitimate scope of judicial determination. "So what do we tell the magistrate?" Parker asked, leaning back in his chair with the expression of a man who had accepted that his friend would not provide simple answers to complex questions. "Do we emphasize Pemberton's confession? His apparent moral conversion? His psychological desperation? You present the facts, as you always do, and you permit the law to function according to its established mechanisms," Whimsy replied. "Pemberton will be convicted. He will serve his sentence. Whether that sentence produces redemption, continued corruption, or merely the passage of years remains a matter beyond legal determination. The machinery of justice cannot address the human soul, Parker. It can only address the human action. For some crimes, that distinction hardly matters. For others, it represents the unbridgeable gap between law and morality." He turned from the window with the deliberate movements of a man who had reached the conclusion of a particular conversation and was now prepared to depart. "I trust you have what you require from my analysis. The Ashford matter is, for all practical purposes, concluded. Julian Ashford is dead, murdered by a man who was simultaneously his victim and his executioner. Eleanor Vane has acquired an unexpected family connection and the prospect of modest financial security. Harold Ashford will spend the better part of his remaining years contemplating the consequences of moral compromise, and Pemberton will spend those same years either achieving genuine redemption or merely perfecting the elaborate self-deception that permitted his original crime." "You're leaving?" Parker asked, noting Whimsy's movement toward the door. "I am. London's fogs are becoming insufferable, and I find myself possessed of an overwhelming desire to return to the civilized comforts of my flat. Additionally, I suspect you have sufficient institutional machinery to process the remaining formalities without requiring further input from an amateur detective. Scotland Yard's competence, while perhaps occasionally in need of refinement, is adequate to the handling of straightforward murder prosecutions." "Straightforward," Parker repeated with something approaching irony. "There was nothing straightforward about the Ashford affair." "On the contrary," Whimsy corrected gently, "the affair was perfectly straightforward in its essentials. A man was murdered by someone with both motive and opportunity. That man was subsequently identified through logical analysis of physical evidence and testimony. The mechanisms of investigation functioned precisely as they should. What remains complicated is not the investigation itself, but rather the interpretation of why the investigation's subject acted as he did. And that, I fear, is a complication that exceeds the legitimate scope of detective work and ventures instead into the dangerous territory of philosophy and psychology." He collected his coat and hat from the stand by Parker's door, preparing for departure into the London fog. "Give my regards to the magistrate when you present the case. And do convey to Eleanor Vane that her father's death, while lamentable, has at least produced the consequence of her eventual emancipation from the limitations of his influence. That is, perhaps, as close as we can approach to justice in a world constructed to resist it." As Whimsy descended the stone steps of Scotland Yard toward the street, the fog seemed to embrace him with the comfort of an old acquaintance, obscuring the precise contours of London's architecture and rendering the city itself almost dreamlike in its uncertainty. Behind him, Parker remained at his desk, contemplating the confusing intersection of law and morality that the Ashford case had so thoroughly exemplified. The investigation was concluded. Justice, in its various forms, would be served. And yet, something essential remained unresolved: the fundamental question of whether the law's mechanisms could ever truly address the deeper pathologies that produced murder, or whether those mechanisms could only treat symptoms while leaving the disease itself entirely intact. It was a question that would haunt Parker for years to come, even as the Ashford case faded into the accumulated archives of solved crimes. And it was precisely the sort of question that whimsy, disappearing into the London fog with the deliberate grace of a man who had learned to navigate uncertainty, knew would never receive a satisfactory answer.